or speaker. So the title is an Uncharted Modernity, the Architecture of Muzharul Islam. Our speaker today is Nurur Rahman Khan, who is a partner of the renowned architectural practice of Tania Karim and Ar Khan and Associates in Dhaka. He graduated from Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology and completed his master's from the same institution with the honor of Ehsanur Rahman Gold Medal. He went on to do his doctoral degree at IUAV University of Venice. He's an educator who has taught and lectured in many universities and seminars, and currently a professor at Bangladesh University, and also adjunct faculty at Stanford University in Dhaka and visiting faculty at North-South University. He's also a master studio guide at IUAB. Among his many hats that he wears, he's a scholar on Muzharul Islam, Louis Khan's work in the subcontinent, and the critique of modern architecture in the region. Among his publications is the book, The Assembly Building, a book published on occasion of the birth centennial of Louis Khan, and Muzharul Islam, Selected Drawings, the first book to be published on the architect Muzharul Islam. So following Nurur Rahman's talk, there will be a response moderation of Q&A by Jeffrey Chusett, who is Associate Professor and Department Chair at Cornell's Department of City and Regional Planning. He's an architect and planner with current research interests that include the fate of historic resources in areas of cultural exchange and conflict, and the conservation of modernist architecture in India, historic cements, and sustainable development. He's widely published and has consulted on various platforms. So may I remind you that please, if you have any questions or comments or responses for the speaker or for Jeffrey, please type them in the chat box. We hope we will have time to address some of your comments and questions after Nurur's presentation and Jeffrey's remarks. So without further ado, I hand over the microphone to Nurur.
Good morning to you over there, and good evening to us over here in Dhaka who've joined in. It's great to be talking here in Cornell, though it's online. I hope you will enjoy, my take on modernism in Bengal and Muzharul Islam. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Can everyone see my screen? Is it okay?
Yes.
All right. I titled this lecture as An Uncharted Modernity. People have been talking about modernism in the region and found some nice ways of trying to, let's say, orient it. I mean, some people have called it critical regionalism, some people have called it situated modernism. But what people have to understand is that what does it mean to the architect? I mean, instead of us trying to label him in a particular way of how we want to look at his understanding of modernity, it is sometimes important to actually take a journey through the life of the architect to understand that what his agenda and his relationship with modernity was. And I think that is what I'm going to try to do over here. So Muzharul Islam was the first architect of Bangladesh, the first architect of both Pakistans actually at that time. It was East Pakistan and West Pakistan then. To start off with, I just want to read a little from here. He was a witness to the famine caused by the British in India, the partition and the bloody aftermath, the futile East-West Pakistan relationship, the language movement and the inevitable liberation war. Muzharul Islam was not contained by the typical post-colonial hangover, and neither was he an advocate of the regional. Islam saw modernity as a politics of nation building and was therefore able to see three otherwise opposed positions: Marxist politics, the progressive attitude of the West, and the need for a strong cultural identity without any conflict with each other. His architecture not only laid the foundation of modern architecture in the region, but also set on to voice a perception of modernity that would fuse the solidarity of the thinkers, artists, writers, and even politicians of his time. An uncharted modernity is the journey of the works of Muzharul Islam seen beyond the typical gaze of modern architecture. Muzharul Islam is considered one of the greatest architects of the Indian subcontinent, and his work till date remains not only as a source for understanding modernity in Bengal, but also to look beyond the confinement of regionalism and charters a path in architecture where architecture is able to recalibrate its role. Islam went through not only a personal journey in his life, but what was happening around him was extraordinary. He was born and lived in a situation at a time in the world where the world changed rapidly, and he needed to address all of this. And it's absolutely amazing that how Islam navigated through all this instead of, let's say, being taken over by one or the other. So a little bit to see over here, he was born in a village in Sundarpon in Murshidabad. Then his father went to Rajshahi Government College. What is important over here is at that same time, the world was changing as we can see what was happening, in Germany. And when he was in Rajshahi, there was a very rich museum called the Barendra Museum where Islam got exposed to the heritage and the history of Bengal at a very early age. Then he went on to do his bachelor's in Calcutta, and at the same time, it was very interesting to see Jainal Abidin was there in Calcutta at the same time. India, especially Calcutta, was on the rise of the left-wing politics. Marxism was the idea of the day, and Rabindric philosophies was also something that was advocated and taught and being talked about in Calcutta at that time. But at the same time, the World War broke loose. Then what happened was the couple of other things that Islam would have witnessed. One of them would be Rabindranath Tagore passing away, and I'm sure he would have seen the huge procession which followed his dead body in Calcutta at that time. And also the other most important thing, he was witness to the famine. The famine, and the same time, it was intertwined with the World War. As we know, it was a man-made famine, a decision that Churchill took to the policy of scorched earth, where when his troops were retreating, they would burn the fields, so the advancing troops would not get anything to eat. But that really ended up causing one of the biggest disaster in Bengal at that time. Just after the war, he got married. A civil war broke up in China. And we need to understand this very young person seeing how the world was totally changing around him. Then became, as he started, when he graduated, went into work for the government, but all this, the world around him again was changing rapidly. The Cold War started. The Burma and Ceylon got independence. Gandhi was assassinated. He went on to, enroll into a 5-year program, undergrad program in the University of Oregon. At the same time, when America was in a situation where the Korean War was happening, and he was witness to that also. Just before he came back, the language movement took place in Bangladesh. Muzharul Islam was sitting in America, anxious to understand what was happening and wishing that he was a part of it when he was there. He came back, and one of the first works that he did was the Faculty of Fine Arts, and which established modernity or architectural modernity in Bangladesh. After that, he went for a postgraduate certificate in AA. On the right, we will see what was happening in China, and the, the Russian Sputnik had taken place, the ballistic missile was launched. All these things was happening when he was right there in London in AA school. He later on came back and he went on to do his master's in Yale University. And we knew that that was also a time when, sorry, I'm just going to go back. That was the time when the Cuban unrest was happening in America also. 1965, the outbreak of the Indo-Pakistan War. Islam came back, and as he was threw himself into design and working on major works for the government, that's when the War of Independence broke out in Bangladesh, in East Pakistan at that time. After the war, 1972, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was freed and he came back to Bangladesh, free Bangladesh. 1975, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was assassinated. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia was assassinated. Now, if we just look at this, I just want you to see him as I wouldn't say direct influences, but something that would have made the person or the persona of Muzharul Islam. Childhood, when he was in Sundarpur, where he learned the importance of language, literature, culture, etiquette. College in Rajshahi, when he was exposed to heritage and history. University in Calcutta, when he was exposed to Marxism, left-wing politics. He was a witness to the famine. He was a witness to the partition. When he was in Oregon, he was exposed to modernism. When he went to AA school in the UK, that was a very important turning point in his work, is because that is when he realized that this the tropical architecture was going to end up becoming a substream and never will be considered as mainstream architecture. And he quickly decided that he was not going to dwell on the tropicality of architecture anymore. When he went on to do his master's in Yale, he was exposed to a new modernism, brutalism. He was exposed to Paul Rudolph, who he brought back to work in Bangladesh later on. He was exposed to Khan, and he was exposed to who he would understand as mainstream architecture, which would be void of any superficial regional strains. The famine in Bengal, I think this is very important to understand that why this was, that had a huge impact on Muzharul Islam. It was devastating. A lot of people are unaware about the famine in Bengal and what it did to people over there, the hunger, the deaths that happened, and the way that the people in the villages died and were just, the bodies were left there. When people died in the streets in Kolkata, they were just burnt on the streets in Kolkata. And we have to understand that that street would have been walked by people like Muzharul Islam and Zainal Abidin. The smoke of the burning bodies would have been, they would have smelt it. And these are experiences that one does not forget. And these are the pictures that Zainal Abidin drew at that time of the famine, which created a huge awareness of the famine. And it was published by the left-wing group, which was quickly banned by the British. And I think it's important for us to understand these two things, that it was advocated by the left wing and it was banned by the British, because this is something where Muzharul Islam picks up on also. How it affected Muzharul Islam is total disrespect for the British and the colonial. He was able to, break away from the colonial so quickly that in his work, there was not even an iota of post-colonial hangover. Islam just returned from West Bengal to East Bengal. It was during the partition. The partition was another I would say a dark chapter in the history of the region. People had to flee suddenly from one part of the other. Their homes were no longer their homes. They were told to go somewhere else. And then the nation became divided just on the basis of religion. And people had to, and it was one of the largest exodus that ever happened. Then was the language movement. Islam was in Oregon at that time. But I just wanted to point out over here that when the partition was happening, Islam was in Kolkata and he had to leave Calcutta to come to Bengal at that time also. The language movement, Islam was in Oregon, and he returned just a few months after to know about what happened during the language movement, where Pakistan tried to make Urdu the common language or the government language in both Pakistan, and the people of Bangladesh or East Pakistan at that time protested, and they broke curfew, and some people were also killed. And then at that same time, to commemorate them, a Shahid Minar or a memorial was erected, which still which was later redesigned again, and then it still stands as a symbol for our martyrs, and it became the beginning of having a World Language Day. Cultural identity. Now, for him, for Muzharul Islam, he did not get into politics to become a politician. For him to understand that what he wanted to do with politics, he wanted to build a nation. And his nation was based on one very simple fact, is our cultural identity. And the way that this happened was that it was a matter of association, that there was a tea table in Muzharul Islam's house where after office people would gather. And some of the common names would be these among other people. And they would be from different, let's say, areas. Kalim Sharafi was a musician and a singer. Muzharul Islam was the architect. Jainal Abidin Kamrul Hassan was the artist. Shamsur Rahman was from literature. And almost every evening they would be around this table. And what was more important to understand is that these people went on to lead Bangladesh and to transform their areas into a total different understanding, and they became the top in their respected fields, all of them. The Jainal Abidin, the person who drew these famine pictures, was there in Kolkata at the same time Muzharul Islam was there. He transformed the typical nostalgia of drawing Bengali landscape and being closer to the folk art to a step towards modernity, but still in drawing subjects from our life. This is Kamrul Hassan, another great painter of Bangladesh, who not only transformed art in Bengal, but he transformed graphic art in Bengal. And he drew some of the best stamps. We can see on the right that these are stamps dedicated to the Liberation War. And till now, the graphics of these stamps has not been equaled. He drew some of the most important posters of that time, where he was talking about solidarity, he was talking about secularism, where he was talking about how it is important for all of us to identify that we are all freedom fighters, not just soldiers. He was able to, represent a Bengali in just our alphabets and say, this is who we are. We have a language, we have alphabet, and therefore we have identity, and therefore we are who we are. And that is why they were able to stand against in the Pakistan and to look at the general of Pakistan as a demon. And this went on to the very end of his life. In 1988, he was on a stage where there was a recitation of poetry. And that day he drew this picture, is the country today is in the clasp of the most shameless person in the world. And that was the title of this drawing. And it was that same day that he passed away. So till the very end, he was this a person who was fighting for something. He was always trying to free the people, and he was also resisting what was wrong. Both Jainul Abidin and Kamrul Hassan was very fond of this one person, and both of them drew Maulana Bhashani. He was the leader of the National Awami Party. And it was very interesting, is it was a left-wing party, a social nationalist party in many ways. And it's very interesting is that how these scholars were all associated with Maulana Bhashani, because it actually, Maulana Bhashani was talking about all of Bengal, all the people of Bangladesh, and that was his strength, is what was good for the whole country, or every walk of life would be good for the nation, and a step away from elitist politics, if I may say so. The other is Shamsur Rahman, the great writer. One of the work that he was awarded the Ekushe Padak for was this poem called Shadhinata Tumi, Liberty You Are. And it's interesting, if we look at these people, one of the thing is their strength to fight for freedom. Their strength is fight for what is right. Their strength to able to lead the country forward. Every one of them, and all the people who came to have tea in Muzharul Islam's house, who sat around that table, including Kalim Sharafi, the great singer. And what tied them together? What tied them together was this person. He was, Muzaffar Ahmed was a professor of Dhaka University. And he was the president of the left-wing Socialist Party, NAP. There was two NAPs. One was under Maulana Bhashani. This was under Muzaffar Ahmed. And Muzharul Islam later on went to become the treasurer of this left-wing party. Muzharul Islam was also very close to Moni Singh, the leader of the Communist Party. He did not join the Communist Party, and I will explain that later on, but his strong affiliation to the left, which started there in Calcutta, his strong rejection of the colonial, which started there in Calcutta, all this was, and his total faith in trying to take, to use modernity as a tool to lift the people of the country. This was all starting to form within Muzharul Islam at that point. What is interesting is to see this triangle. I mean, otherwise, like I said, it was almost opposed, but he was someone who saw no difference between able to address them. And one of the reasons why he was able to bring these three aspects into his life is because he looked at each one of them with the amount of rejection. And the rejections were Bengali identity without the overtone of regionalism and the romanticism of the vernacular. Marx without communism, because why he rejected communism? Because in communism, there was hardly any space for culture. And that is something that Muzharul Islam would not, was not very fond of that idea, because the Bengali identity has a very strong cultural heritage. And the other one is that he was totally convinced with the development of what was happening in the US, especially after the World War, but he did not advocate capitalism. So I think when he was rejecting these, he was finding his own way to navigate and to bring together all the three aspects. But one of the most important thing is the total rejection of the British, which is very important, because that allowed him to almost fast track what a lot of people would, later on have termed as decolonization. Muzharul Islam once asked me is that to be a Bengali, he said, to be a Bengali, one has to be a world man. And he truly was a world man. Favorite author, Karl Marx, Isaac Asimov, I think Carl Sagan also, Rabindranath Tagore. Favorite music, jazz, classical music, ballet, opera. His daughter speaks fondly is that whenever he'd come back from abroad, he'd be carrying some Louis Armstrong or some other jazz albums back with him. And of course, Tagore and Nazrul, favorite sport, football. He was the captain of the football team in Shupur Engineering University, where he, being a Muslim, would have been a minority, but still he was the captain of the team. Architects he spoke of, Frank Lloyd Wright, Alvar Aalto, Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, and Kahn. This I'm just talking from on the basis of the interviews and Arate Suzaki, based on the interviews that I've had with him. I'm sure other people would have heard about other architects from him also. What is important is that he knew what Bengal was. He had a great understanding that this was not a young place. We have a heritage that goes back thousands of years. And he knew the importance of this area for over centuries, because how it was one of the points where the Silk Route and the spice route connected. He also knew that we had houses and actually built structures that were happening from the 6th century BC, and we were making huge learning centers like Paharpur, Shampur, Bihara, these monasteries, and which are in the north of Bengal as early as or as late as I would say 1200 to 1300 years back. Muzharul Islam was very much aware of who we are. He knew our heritage, he knew our history, I think, and he stood very firmly on this. Once on an interview, he was asked that he was asked a question on the Parliament building by Khan, and he was said that it's a very expensive building. How does he think about a country so poor spending so much money on the Parliament building? Muzharul Islam's quick reply was that we are only at the moment suffering from only one kind of poverty, and that is economic poverty. We lack no other poverty, number one. Number two, it would be wrong to assume that Bangladesh is a poor country, because we were rich for over 2,000 years. It is only after when the British came that Bangladesh was thrown into poverty, or Bengal was thrown into poverty. So we understand the total understanding of Muzharul Islam, of his background in terms of the totality of the heritage of Bengal, and which drove him to find a modernity within modernity. And it happened in the very first work. He needed no trial and error. In the very first work, he knew that this is not what was going to be. He did not need to borrow anything from international style, the Art Deco or the colonial architecture. He knew what he had to do on the very first work. And how did he know this? He knew this because on one hand, he knew that where his intellectual understanding of the politics lies. Also, he knew about the importance of the Bengali identity and its heritage. And then he used all this to find or to use modernity as and the ideologies of modernity to build the country and to take the country forward. And he knew that is the only way forward, and he never looked back from that. The Fine Art Institute, the one master stroke, one stroke, the first building which established modern architecture in Bangladesh. We absolutely no strains to do with I would say, overtoned regionalism. But a lighter building at that time, which started off with the concept of not trying to make a tropical architecture, but with the very understanding that he was working on a site where the site had lots of trees, and he was going to make this area where the students would come out and sit under the trees, and the architecture would go from then onward. And then came this beautiful plan where the printmaking department surrounded the ditch in the back, and the painting departments were placed so it would take the breeze from the south and the light from the north, and they would situate just between the trees and the front gallery and the entry pavilion. We're talking 1952. 1952, 53, there was no one who had drawn a plan like this in this part of the world, and maybe all the way up till Japan. And then, of course, the realization of the project, unseen work, unknown modernity, a place that feels familiar, a building that somehow feels so familiar. People would go out and sit in the gardens, people would use these spaces, and it would all be drawn with his own hands. This is the entry pavilion. As one comes in, on the right side, there's this beautiful stair that goes to the first floor, and the way forward is towards the rest of the classes. This is a drawing of the stair itself. What's interesting is that if the stair is a sculpture, then that Muzharul Islam made space for a mural, because which is this backdrop wall over here. The brick temples of Bengal are well renowned, and he needed a way to educate the students who would come here and tell them how far back their heritage goes. And from that one, with this one wall and this design, which I feel is a tribute to all the brick terracotta works of Bengal in all the temples and the viharas. And of course, that central space, which was in his very first sketch. This is the printmaking towards the round ditch at the end of this site. The pavilion that encourages us to spend time there, and the ground, which is so familiar to us that we would just go as close to the ground as possible. The ground is very important in Bengal, in whether the way it changes into a ghat, whether it becomes a uthan for the way we use it, the way where we situate ourselves and our architecture. But whatever it is, there's a very understanding of the ground is very important in a country where it's like very, where it's basically floodplains. Deltaic country, the understanding of the ground and the differences of the ground is very important to us. The spaces still teach the students without even teachers. And this building still remains till today as the best teacher that the students ever had. The public library, which happened at the same time, which became the Dhaka University Library also. In this particular work, Islam took his agenda a little further. Not only he designed a wonderful building, which had a very free front where there would be a ramp taking everybody to the first floor, and the entry into the library would be a ceremonial entry from the first floor. And that's the ramp, and you'd go into the first floor to enter the building. That's the reading hall, placed on north-south to avail the light and air. That's the ramp that would start and you approach on the first floor. But what was important is that in this work, he brought in two people. One was Nurur Ahmed. The other one, I will talk about him later on, but the importance was that the way that he was associated to these people were his left-wing politics. They were all his, I would say, his Marx brothers and sisters. And this is the most important work on the ground level, which is a mural done by Novera, which is next to the ramp as you go up. So as one would enter the building to go up to the ramp, that they'd be greeted by this wonderful mural done by Novera. And then as you come up, there would be three more works, or two before you go into the reading hall. One is reception, then there is a backdrop wall, and finally one in the reading hall. And this is the one in the reading hall. As you see as you enter, it's a ceremonial entry into the reading hall. But as I have highlighted over here, you'd go up the ramp, you'd approach the a curved reception area, and then see the reading hall. But what's important is the three works over here: the boatman, the fisherman, and the other untitled work by Hamidur Rahman. Hamidur Rahman was the person who designed the Shahid Minar. And the importance of his design is far-reaching. I mean, this minar is still replicated in every school, college in all over Bangladesh. Even when people in the neighborhoods want to celebrate 21 February, which the language Martyrs' Day, they would make their own little Shahid Minars. And whenever they would make it, it's so powerful, they would make it in the way that Hamidur Rahman has designed. So he has become immortal in the history of Bengal. And again, bringing him board was the whole idea of having someone who would draw or depict the life of the common people. This is the boatman. And then across from that would be the fisherman. And you would teach all these people coming to this building is how this country is not about the city. It is not about this university library. It is all about the totality of all the people in the country. And then he was celebrating the boatmen and the fishermen, and the end, a beautiful untitled mural which graces the reading room. He went to the tropical school after these two works. What was interesting over here is that when he went over here, he knew what he was never going to do anymore. He quickly became aware that this tropical school of architecture was going to become a sub-branch. And this whole understanding of tropical architecture would not really be a part of mainstream architecture, but would be seen as the architecture of the region. And this is something that he did not want. He looked at this as a neo-colonial attitude of looking at this part of the world, and he, in a way, rejected this. This was the courses that he was studying at that time, and he was very correct in, and they would do these projects. So it was more of a design studio rather than coursework. And his assumption that where the tropical architecture would go on to become this substream, it becomes very clear. And in this issue of the Commonwealth, this is, and what I'm trying to show over here is that in the issue, they had over 22 pages dedicated to one part of Africa because Maxwell Drew and Fry was working there. But all of India, Pakistan, and Ceylon got only 3 pages. And this would be a page, one page would be taken over by Corbusier, and the next page would be India, Pakistan, and Ceylon together on one page, and the building from Pakistan would be Muzharul Islam's library. And this happened much later, but Islam knew that this was going to happen. And that is why he dropped this whole notion of trying to celebrate the tropical. It also happened, or what I would say, Yale enforced this. For Yale, it was not only Yale, it was about finding Rudolph, it was about finding Kahn, and it was about finding a way forward for him. He knew that he was not going to be a subsect in architecture. He comes back and his architecture immediately moves away from this lightweight, tropical, I would say architecture in terms of having louvers, brousselets and all that. And he finds and he draws a new architecture in his own house. Architecture which is very strong in its form and space, very modern for the time, and had beautiful mezzanine bedroom spaces in the bedroom, with the mezzanine studies in the bedrooms, had this way the inner space flowed into the lawn, the edge of the wall there were sitting areas. And even though it was doing this play of architecture, it was also at the same time embracing what a Dhaka life is, where people would not only sit inside, but would take their tea out into the lawn. A very common feature of the educated middle class of Dhaka at that time would be having tea in the lawn. Somewhat British, if I may say so, but it would become a very Dhaka culture. And then how this lawn is celebrated with the seats towards the edge, where he makes the lawn an event space. it's hard to get pictures of this building, but I just was able to share these. 1968, 66, 68, they won this job for the 5 polytechnics. He invited Stanley Tigerman to come and work with him on this project. They did this wonderful report on how to develop a master plan for East Pakistan approach to, again, the word tropical keeps coming up. But as they were doing all these researches, if I would like you to really look at the plans that Stanley was working at that time on the plans quite a bit, and the way the plans were evolving under Stanley at that point. And this is the workshop that developed under Stanley at that point, something that Muzharul Islam was very quick to change. And I had an interview with Stanley Tigerman, and he said is that Muzharul Islam was very intelligent. He decided not to pick a fight with me. He knew that I would have to leave for America. And the moment I did, he changed it. And he told me is that it is a matter of economy. What you had designed was too expensive to build, and we needed to change that, which was not necessarily true, but he had another agenda. He needed to look at these master plans these were the master plans that were being drawn up, and he needed to look at them with a different perspectives. The building itself is, sorry, I think there's embedded file. So the thing is that the building has these lines which translate into these wonderful bays that are able to shift and change. Yes, it was more economic to build it in brick, but what is more important is that this was a far more better building which addressed the climate in a better way, and it was actually a much more beautiful architecture. It is one of the most beautiful plans that Muzharul Islam has left behind for us to see over time. But also the 5 master plans. They had to take these buildings and situate them into 5 different places of Bangladesh. Yes, they were placed all over in these parts of Bangladesh. Apparently, they look simple. But what is not simple about it is that each of these master plans address that particular district in a way and which brings out that and celebrates all the aspects of that area. In Borishal, it's all about water, and he was able to design this series of water starting from the very first, which is a very interesting approach as you come in through this narrow entrance into the site and see the water body, the next one and the building and the next one of that. So, and he was able to celebrate this Dhan Nodi Khal, which means the paddy fields, the rivers and the water channels of Borishal into his master plan. Same goes for the one in Bobara. It's very famous, the area very famous for their mango orchards. And the whole approach to the project is against this mango orchard. And then you come, and then we know how beautiful it smells, the flowers before the fruit. It is, and that is also iconized even in our national anthem, the fragrance of the mango flowers, and you drive, approach the project past it, and then make a turn to come to the building and to the front of the building. So, and also that little bit of water body on the south, which would humidify the building in a beautiful way, because it is this part of the country is in more drier, is more dry compared to other parts of Bangladesh. Rangpur Polytechnics, again, filled with orchards, celebrating the different mangoes and the lychees, and also the other fruits of the region, and how he would actually fill this whole polytechnic with these gardens. And then first Pabna. The Pabna, where his approach is these diagonal lines, and it's a shift away from the other ones because he needed to create a dimensional change between some which would be a rather ordinary rectangular site, and he translated by shifting these two arrangements with these diagonal lines, something that Muzharul Islam later used in many other master plans. The Sylhet project, Sylhet's known for his water bodies also, and where he actually, as someone comes in, they almost find themselves literally on to the water body itself. This master plan changed a little bit in the execution. And that is what the, and this is the Sylhet Polytechnic, the workshops against the water body, the residential quarters. A very simple building, just on these parallel walls, north-south, totally can be opened as to need, as to climate, as to requirement, as to use, as to the time of day. And this, wonderful aspect of where he's addressing climate, where he's addressing the nature of use of the people, but he does not bring that into the forefront. Rather, he brings this whole idea of a very modern building as a solution. That's the director's bungalow and the water tower. Muzharul Islam whispering into Khan's ears. This is not what I said. This is what Doshi told me once, is that when one sees the work of Khan in Dhaka, one can hear Muzharul Islam whispering into Khan's ears. And it really stuck with me, and it probably is true, because when Khan started his work, he was obsessed with, and he writes a lot about the deltaic nature of the country. And his first scheme of the master plan was quite horrendous, where he had this deltaic landscape, which thank God did not get built. And it would be Muzharul Islam who told him about what we have in Bangladesh, the great biharas, the other great structures. And I think that is what led Muzharul Khan to design a stronger building, rather than a building that he would have just tried to pick up from the situation of the vernacular. The streets. Muzharul Islam took Khan many times to the old part of Dhaka. The life of old Dhaka is totally on the streets, as most parts of the old cities in this part of the world. Khan translated this into his building, the ambulatory of the Parliament building. The single dome mosque. Muzharul Islam gave Khan a lot of books to study, especially on the history of Bengal. And one of the most predominant mosques of Bengal would be the single dome mosque. And this is what would translate into the mosque of the Parliament building, where Khan takes the turrets and makes them larger, what Khan calls the hollow columns. And then he translates this into the mosque of the Parliament building. Jahangirnagar University, this is just before the war. This is just going to go past this, a wonderful master plan for a university, but what is most important is to realize this water body is still one of the most important water bodies where we have migratory birds come to rest so close to the city. And Muzharul Islam made sure that his master plan would interplay with the buildings in such a way that sometimes he'd go close, but sometimes he'd leave enough distance to allow the birds to have their place. He even created, as we can see, an island just for the birds to sleep in at night. The Jahangirnagar University master plan, a stroke of genius, where we know if we take a courtyard with 4 sides, according to the climate of Bangladesh, we will have 2 sides, which is wrong. That means we'll have 2 sides which is exposed to the east and west, especially the glare and the heat of the west would be totally wrong. So he would take a triangle and you'd be able to cut it in such a way that you'd be able to shield off the West and still bring in the light and air. And that is what he was able to do in these hostel blocks. Apparently it seems solid, but when from the angle the light goes in. A little detail. And another thing where the left always stayed in Muzharul Islam, he would never waste. He would make things as cheap as possible. He would never waste. Every time he would make a project, he knew that we have limited resources, and he needed to take this resource as far as he can. So with just one little change in the detail of the joinery of the angle, of the brick, he was able to bring this beautiful detail which adorns the facade of these buildings. Designed everything, the chairs, even the beds, the sockets for the switches, everything was designed by Muzharul Islam, the inner courtyard, the exterior facade. NIPA, National Institute of Public Administration, again, a very strong statement by Muzharul Islam. The archetype of Bengal would actually be a pavilion. This is all we need. We need a roof over our head. We do not need walls. In our climate where it's hot and humid, the only way to really get any comfort is to have air, go over our bodies as much as possible. And then also to enhance that would be able to create this microclimate with trees around us, to create a life with flora and fauna. So this particular painting termed Bangla Ragini, which means a raga to Bengal, it would be wonderfully translated into this building by him. Nipa is like a pavilion. And how it extends out on top, how every part of it is shaded. He once told me, if you look at everywhere where rice is planted in the world, everybody works with a triangular, a triangular cap over their head, whether it's Japan, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's China, whether it's Bangladesh. And they learned very quickly that all they need is to protect the head and the upper torso, and that would be enough, because they would need to work in the sun and in the rain. And so we need to create a building that needs to work in the sun and the rain, and it needs to extend out to protect its head and upper torso. The building is very strong in nature. Once when I asked him that compared to his other buildings, this almost had a classical statement. He was very quick in answering, saying is that we're trying to create it's the National Institute of Public Administration. He said, we're trying to create these government officers who would feel inferior to the West Pakistanis, because many ways the West Pakistanis are taller, bigger, healthier, and Bengalis are smaller in structure. So he said, I want to bring them in a building that will give them a stronger backbone. And that is what, so it is, none of his work is without agenda that he knows that is going to play out in the minds of the people who would use these buildings. The Chittagong University, a milestone in architecture for Bangladesh, a realization that when we have the hills and hillocks in Chittagong and Sylhet and those areas, we cannot really build on them. They are made of soil, and we need the new architecture to how to address these slopes. Muzharul Islam not only understood that, but he also understood the delicate nature of the ecological system of waterways and the land in these in a contour like this. And Islam was able to find very quickly the main water channel where all the water would collect in this site, and then the way to how to navigate between the hillocks and connect the different aspects. And this wonderful way of how the man situates himself in nature is a remarkable step forward for Muzharul Islam in his architecture. Is also the way that he designs, as we can see, is his buildings are never on the hills, but just very close to the hills themselves. What he achieves by doing this is creating a wonderful section, a section that creates a space which we have never seen before. The space is this: as people stay in these balconies or come out into these balconies, they almost can't see the sky. They see this slope with the trees going up, this elevated suspended space where the slope goes up and goes underneath your feet into the ground. And this he knew was the way that you can only build in these in these contoured areas. To make a point, he did make the vice chancellor's house with a huge retaining wall and showed everybody how costly it would be to make it otherwise. And again, all the time, Islam was always concerned about his country's resources, and then how far the resources needed to go to serve the people of his country. This is the hostels of Chittagong University. One of the greatest work in Chittagong University, I would think, is the auditorium also. This is a wonderful work where we can see one green room serving not only the stage in the inside, but the stage on the outside, which is amphitheater stage. And it happens because he situated, again, he found exactly where he was going to place this building. And that was going to be very close to a hill where you take the slope of the hill as to become his natural amphitheater. And again, have that one green room serving the inside and the outside. These are the readers' quarters. This particular drawing has tremendous importance to me in a way to understand Muzharul Islam. This is the drawing of the mosque. But in this drawing, he shows tremendous amount of austerity. He takes only one cross. This whole sheet has all the drawings necessary to build this mosque. He has one cross where he replicates this one mihrab, which is different. And inside the cross where he will have the light fixtures, even he draws in the 3 dimension. How he will strengthen the cross, he gives the indication to the structural engineer. And in this one sheet, he has put all the information required to make this building. It's a tremendous way to not only to have, to demonstrate his whole idea of austerity, of not wasting, of finding a way to make things not cheaper, but just enough, no unnecessary. And that also is demonstrated in putting all of it together into one sheet. Liberation War. This was very important for Muzharul Islam. We went through a bloody war with West Pakistan, but we rose. The people joined the camps, and you have to understand there were very few armaments. They had to basically shoot another soldier and take their rifles in order to become armed. And that is the way that these people trained themselves to fight, where others had to escape. And then the Mukti Jodha, or the freedom fighters, were born from all classes of life, from women to men to young to old. Everybody participated in one way or the other. But at the end of that, when we had a free country, Islam's work changed again. His work found a new strength. He no longer needed to have his work be of an agenda, because he finally finds himself in a free country. And one of the works that he first did was the Jaipur Hut housing, a limestone factory housing. Wonderful way of how he addresses the central courtyards and makes these very strong buildings, the way he would address climate, have these very modern, tight planning of the apartments themselves, and the strength of the building. I must remind you that this location is very close to, less than an hour away from Paharpur. And I think that also had tremendous influence on him, where he knows that, we have one of the largest built forms of Bengal on so far away, which is very strong. And over here, he brings that strength into his architecture. And in Paharpur, if you ever visit it, one of the most important, I would say, one of the things that hits you most is that when you see the angular edge of the outer cells, and you can see almost the sharpness of those cells, and it is something that has found its way into this project. The National Library and Archives, 78, 79.
So,
The Warrior.
Nurur, perhaps if you take another 5 minutes, so
Yes,
we have
I'd be
time
done
after
actually.
that too. Okay, great.
I would
Thank
be
you.
done in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The Warrior, over in this way, this is the last project that I want to show of him, and over here, it's important to see him as a warrior at rest. He no longer needs to free a country. He no longer needs to create identity. He no longer needs to use architecture to make a revolution and to take people forward. He's done all that. He now the warrior finds himself rested in a free Bangladesh. And I think that comes out into this particular work, where the building is almost just for architecture itself. Yes, it addresses climate, it addresses light, it addresses our building technology, but what it does is far more than that. It does not limits itself, or neither does it try to celebrate themselves or bring themselves forward. It is purely about architecture. And within itself, he finds his other freedoms, where when he was drawing this building, apparently when we see it first, one almost perceives it as a square, till you realize that it is not. It is multiple squares overlaid, stretched, shifted, and he takes not only total freedom in making his own statement, but also making an architecture that is his also. The building when it was being constructed and the building now. So for Islam, modernity was a tool, a way forward, a way of resistance, a belief, a conviction, an agenda, a politics. For what? To build a country, to resist the trap of regionalism, to be at, to counter the gaze, self-respect, heritage, and identity. It was more than a style for him. It was much more than just a step forward. He did not pick this at will. Once when he was asked, why did you get so involved in politics? Islam replied, probably because it was the most architectural thing to do at that time. It is from his political standpoint that he was able to develop from the role of an activist to that of a guide, and in a free country, that of a visionary. His nation-building politics as his driving force became the formative gene of his modernity within modernity itself. Thank you, everyone, for staying on this long.
Thank you, Professor Khan. That was a fantastic introduction to an architect that most of us don't know well, at least most of us in the morning side of your presentation. A couple of things strike me. I'm particularly gratified by the way you were able to integrate political interests, the context, the history into the architecture. We often think about modernism as a choice, as a series of formal and material choices, but in fact, the modernity is a project that varies from country to country and place to place, and was often leftist, at least until corporate America found it in the 1950s. The other thing that I think was wonderful that you pointed out was the way in which his own life was interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, his friendships, the way he brought other artists and activists in. And that was another thing that I think was important to the modernist project in many places, whether it was the Bauhaus in Germany or I'm thinking of the friends that Joseph Allen Stein had in India that were all similarly from ballet to Tibetan art, folk art, to etc. You had a wonderful quote, "What does modernity mean to the architect?" And I think it's important to understand that the architect is not just operating theoretically, the architect is making something. And similarly critical is to think about the building as more than just a polemic. And I think you do that as well. We're looking at these buildings, but there's so much more to them than even one can say in just a few minutes. They're more than modernism. They are actually the places where people live and have lived for now decades. And a final point I would make, because I know we want to open it for questions, is right from the beginning, it was clear that materials were important, the utility of concrete to modernism, the brick that has its historical antecedents, the deliberate choices, the building as a teacher. I thought that was a wonderful idea, and I think it's something shared by other modern architects very often. And the clarity of the plan, extraordinary throughout his time, that you could really see instantly what the ideas were, what the building was from the plans. So a lot of other ideas, a lot of other things were there that I would love to respond to, but I'm going to go ahead and start asking some of the questions that have come up. Two interesting questions. First of all, what led Islam to choose study at the University of Oregon? Why not in Pakistan or the Sir J.J. School in Mumbai, for instance?
Okay, good question. The J.J. School was strongly, well, I'd say it revolved strongly against the Art Deco, as we know. And the other thing is that he got a scholarship to go to the US. And also, I think, you see, Islam, once very candidly said is that I used them. And he said, and he knew that if he needed to build his own country, he needed to go where progress was actually taking place. He had to learn from there. And he said that I went there to understand progress. And otherwise I would not come back and have a vision for my own country. And that is what is more important than him to quickly find a degree, rather than that he waited to have that scholarship to go there and study architecture.
So the next question is, what would you consider the essential elements that formed Bengali identity in his work? You mentioned the choice of the brick from the temple, but what were some others? Because he also used elements like the British lawn. Mm-hmm. So, but you also talked about not being trapped to a vernacular. So is there something else more subtle or more physical that Islam would say, well, this is...
I think one of the ways to look at Islam's work would be to look at Paharpur. When we look at Paharpur, we see the central building, the great monastery that I showed, the Vihara. We have the central building, we have the grounds, we have the cells, we have all of that, and we have it made in brick, but it is not about those things. It is more about the strength of that building, where the central center is the purpose, and what you have around it is where you stay. And every morning you get up, you're constantly reminded of the purpose in the center, something that Khan even picked up. So when he was making the assembly building. So I think Islam roots his strength into very far into the past, not the immediate past. He never started from the last 200 years. He went back over 1,000 years, and he looked at our architecture over a period of 1,000 years, and he found a modernity within our work. And that is why he was able to stitch his modernity with what you would consider a Bengali identity. Because if I ask you in a different way, is that how is modernity uh, offset from industrial revolution? Or if I say is that if we consider that a society that agrees to have a school set up where they would actually institutionalize education and have their children go there, would that be modernity? And if you take that as indices of modernity, and to have a city where you'd have grid system of the road, have a granary, a treasury. Now all that happened in Bengal over 1,000 years ago. So you see, he did not need to find an alternate route to modernity. He was able to draw strength from skipping the last 200-300 years and going back further, and then attaching that to what he would consider our identity.
So that's a wonderful sort of answer, but also entree to a question from Lawrence Trua from Syracuse, who's also asking about the sort of conscious rejection of nationalist symbolism or the trap of regionalism in Islam's work, because so many architects in newly independent nation states in South and Southeast Asia would try deliberately to integrate national symbols. I mean, even Stein used jollies and and local craft in the tile work, and there were the National Buddhist Library in Burma has its forms by Pope, and then of course Baba and all sorts of people were trying to come up with something that would make modernism essentially there.
Right.
So, trying to figure out what that balance is, I think you seem to be saying it has to be a deeper connection, right, than a superficial symbol.
Yeah, in a way, if you just look at his choice of authors and music, that is absolutely, I have not found another person to really share that kind of, that matrix. But the people around him, they all were like that. They were all, they would be writing in Bengali and reading European literature. They would be singing Tagore songs, but also listening to jazz and ballet and orchestra. So I think that that group of people who all went on to lead their different fields, they became this huge source of energy, where each one also reinforced that the fact that they needed to, in a way, reject regionalism to go forward. I think that was their kind of nation building politics that I keep saying. And it was not a way to undermine regionalism. They were all about place. Kamrul Hassan drew all these fantastic cubist drawings, but it was all about the life of Bengal. He never drew anything else besides that. So, or the people of Bengal. So they saw no conflict with place and being modern. And I think what you said was very important, is that modernism is almost an agenda at different places. It has a different life at different places around the world. For me to understand Muzharul Islam, I saw him better when I first discovered, or when I first stood in front of Casa del Fascio by Tarani. And I see this person who were absolutely convinced about the National Socialist Party, which later turned fascist. But that work singularly changed Italian architecture forever. So there was nothing wrong. You see, he belonged to a fascist party, but his architecture was not fascist. So I think, in a way, for me to look at that building and see how strongly a person's understanding of one's politics reflects out in architecture, and then is able to reject certain, it is able to filter other people's understanding of that politics. I think that was very interesting for me, and that kind of gave me, I think, I was able to look at Islam with certain filters rather than trying to find similarities and connections.
So it's in a way, all of the architects in a way are doing a bit of a reductivism in order to get a clarity to the architecture, which can be read, which can pronounce itself, which can present itself in a landscape, whatever that landscape is.
Yes.
So there's another question here, somewhat related, which is, how would you position Islam in a kind of international conversation among other architects, such as Alto, or well, you pointed out he liked Frank Lloyd Wright, and I thought his own house was a wonderful Wrightian section, by the way. It reminded me very much of the Millard House. But did he connect a lot or see himself as part of a conversation with architects around the globe or ideas outside of Bangladesh?
He had, in a way, a total faith in the four masters, Alto, Wright, Corbusier, and Mies, because I think when we spoke, one of the things he said is that their architecture had purity. And that was something that took quite some time for me to understand. He would just leave it at, I mean, he'd not really elaborate on things, but he kind of said their architecture had purity. And the way that we look at Muzharul Islam, when I asked Professor Samsul Waris, is that if you were to describe Muzharul Islam, Samsul Waris worked with Muzharul Islam and knew him very closely. And one of the words he used was shuddhi, which is purity. He said that the intent of Muzharul Islam was pure. So it's very interesting is that how that strong notion of purity in architecture, if there is something called purity in architecture, I mean, there could be a lot of debate against that, but his understanding about having a very clarity in thought, drawing, the build, I think that all reduced himself to his intent, which was always pure.
Yes, another question here. How have his architecture and the lessons of his life that you so lucidly introduced shaped the current architectural thinking in Bangladesh?
Right. Often I have students asking me, what is the philosophy of Islam's architecture? And I say he doesn't have a philosophy of architecture. What he has is a philosophy of life. So what I would tell the architects in Bangladesh or in this generation is that, do we have a philosophy of our life and what we want to do with ourselves? And what do we mean to society? Where do we stand in time? And it is that idea or philosophy or standpoint which will become our let's say the way of our architecture. So Islam was like that. He did not have architectural philosophy. And that is, I think, where he really is able to so quickly decide. He had this wonderful philosophy towards life, what his purpose was. And he would use architecture just in the same note. It would be not architectural philosophy and a life philosophy. And I think this is where we lack. with the media and all the publication around us, we are drawn in 1,000 different ways. And so much so, and especially with social media nowadays, it's very hard to even have an idea of our own life. It is our life is too exposed, so cluttered. And I think that is where we really lack in being able to um, draw strength about an idea we can reflect in architecture.
We were talking a little bit before the session about how in India modernism became part of the Nehruvian project. In a way, what that's meant today is that modern architecture is not anymore in favor in India, because the Nehruvian project is not in favor in India. So, and that's very clear in how modern architecture is struggling to be preserved or to be valued or be maintained. So my question is, how are it looked from your images like the buildings are around and are still in use and are still vibrant. What is the future of these buildings?
We've been able to list his works. We're in the process of listing his works under the UNESCO heritage, and it is being approved by even our Prime Minister. So there is a lot of regard for him and his work. Some of his work has been, defaced in different ways, which we will probably try to recover. But there is an understanding or a reverence towards this work, especially of the community. I think like we were discussing is that Islam and his followers or his associates, I would say, all these people coming from art, architecture, literature, music, they changed the way that we will go, lead these different fields in Bengal. It is actually our time to build on it. And one of the things that I think you will be pleasantly surprised that if you do come to Bangladesh is that there is a total faith in modern architecture in Bengal. There is this faith in it. And Islam he brought in Stanley Tigerman, he brought in Paul Rudolph, he brought in Luai Khan, he brought all these people in order to have this larger, or I'd say lots of examples for us to look at and to fall back on and to understand what modern architecture is. And I think that really helped at least architecture to go forward. The same I would say for art is that with people like Kamrul Hassan and Jainal Abidin starting off very early, the artists of Bangladesh are very well renowned, and the people who were associated with them and followed from them, they're world famous. And I think that that is quite interesting to observe if you especially look at art and architecture.
Well, I know there are more questions that people would like to ask. We are supposed to end at 12:30, which is just a few minutes from now. So I'm gonna put one more out there, if which is if
there's a question by Nima.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which probably it's a great question, so you'll want to answer it with full thing. But let me say, she points out she's fascinated by the evidence of parsimony that you showed us, like the Mosque drawing, the public buildings in a country with limited resources. How does this fit with the sense of a pure architecture, a creation of monumental works that draw on the viharas for inspiration?
Okay. One has to understand that Islam was not about making architecture. He had a bigger agenda. He did not use modernity to build architecture also. He used modernity to build a nation. So he is able to see architecture with the amount of detachment, which is very, very interesting. He does not need to place in order to be off the place. He knows what he wants to do. And that is where his purity in his thought process lies. Rather than him trying to be pure in terms of architecture, in terms of materiality, in terms of details or iconography or landscape and things like that. So I think this is something that we need to understand, that we need, Islam needs to be seen with that amount of detachment. And that is why when later on when Khan met Stanley Tigerman, one of the comments that Khan made to Tigerman was that, why did Muzharul Islam involve himself so much into politics? So I think that he basically had these two, almost two personas, but his architecture does come from a greater sense of what he was going to do with his architecture. And that is why I think he's able to detach himself in a very interesting way.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to thank Professor Khan and everybody here who came to a really terrific presentation, for opening our eyes and a wonderful conversation. And I hope we have a chance soon to do this again, because I certainly learned a lot.
Thank you so much for everyone staying so long.
Thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you, Nurur and Jeffrey, for the wonderful conversation.